We should have been commemorating the Golden Jubilee of the Republic. Today marks the 50th anniversary of the Republic. Why is it that we are still not a sovereign people? That is the question that all Gambians should interrogate today. We must look at the past in order to know how the present came into being. And we must know the present before we are in a position to shape the future. We as a people became a people through a historical process. And without knowing our history, we cannot know who we are. And without knowing who we are, we cannot be the architects of our own destiny. The Gambia we know today went through a century of change, and we understand that that change must be comprehended by all of us. The Gambia we know today did not exist when the explorers came to the Gambia in search of trading facilities to develop their own economies. It is a long history, but it is wrong to say that Gambia has been colonized for 400 years. History does not permit us to draw such a conclusion. We will see the stages that the country went through to be where we are today, commencing at a time when the British Crown started to establish settlements all over the globe. The history of the Gambia will remind us our captain was sent by a governor based in Sierra Leone, whose name now is attached to a squire in Banjul called Makati Squire. And that governor sent Captain Grant to come to the Gambia to begin the process of consolidating a British settlement on our land. When that captain came and went to Bathurst, he discovered that island, which will ultimately be the founding coast on the land that the British decided to build their colony. His description of Bathurst was that it was easily accessible to those who were owners of factories in the upper part of the river. That shows that there were British traders in the upper part of our river. His evaluation revealed that those traders were actually shipping their goods through Jufre, which was 25 miles inland. And he felt that Bathurst would be much closer and could be used as a strategic point, because those traders felt insecure where they were. And if they built a fort in Bathurst, they'll be able to protect their traders. And they were trading in wax, hides, ivory. So it is important to see the economic might of the area at the time and not see the land as a poor land. It is because of the wealth that existed that trading was made possible. And that is why they decided to settle in 1816, where we now have Banjul. He was instructed to engage in building a relationship with the kings in the area. And the instruction revealed the very statements that they should restore the age-old treaties that were no longer functioning. Yes, for centuries the British traveled into the Gambia and looked for areas where they could establish settlements through treaties. But for many years they had abandoned those areas because of their struggle with the French for the domination in the area. Consequently, they were asked to restore the old age relationship by 1816. Grant did meet the King of Combo. All the forces under the command of Grant also did meet other kings. They restored Bara, they restored Nyomi, they restored Combo, and signed treaties with those kings. For example, with the King of Combo, it's 103 bars of iron annually to be paid to him, and 10 to his alcaide, the people we now call alkali, and 1 bar to the praise singer, the person now we now call griot. So you can see the system that existed, and the British had to engage in a relation of equality with those who were kings in the area. For Bara, they paid 300 bars. So in short, those kings were owners of their territories, and they were not under the jurisdiction of the British Crown. How did colonialism came to be dominant? That is the issue that we should interrogate today. The colonialists continued to establish settlements in Makati, the Ceded Mile, in many parts of the country. And between 1816 all the way to 1850, they had managed to sign more than 18 treaties with the kings in the various areas of the Gambia to show that those territories were sovereign. But then things began to change. Their trade could not be enhanced because of wars that were taking place in what we now call the Gambia. It reflected very clearly in the trade statistics. In 1839, they were able to export 153,000 tons, and in 1850, the situation began to change. From the tons that they were able to export and import, 153 and 162 that were actually exported, 153 imported. It shows that the balance of trade was in favor of the territories that existed in the Gambia. The balance of trade began to change later, but up to the 1850s, you began to see a decline in trade from 69,000 tons in terms of imports to 79,000 tons in export. But regardless of the drop in trade, we can see that the exports were more than the imports. So if anybody tells you that we are a dependent people, then they do not know our history. They do not know the resources available at the time which compelled the powers, France, Britain, to this area. So it is a falsification of history to say that Gambia was an improbable country, that it was believed that it could never exist as a state. That is a misconception. The resources that were available, the trade statistics revealed that the British benefited immensely from trading with those who lived in the area at the time. But to ensure that they controlled the trade, this is what compelled the British to be able to control the country and take ownership of it. That is why, after the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, the British decided to consolidate their settlements in what we now call the Gambia. It was on the 10th of August, 1889, that the British and the French signed a treaty defining the territory that would belong to France and Britain, so that they will begin to consolidate their colonial rule. Many people should understand that the British Crown, as far back as 1843, decided to create its agenda for domination all over the world. It had what you call the Imperial Act. When you talk about imperialism now, it's like an insult, but in reality, there was an Imperial Act in Britain in 1843, which empowered the British Crown to establish settlements abroad. And where the British settlements are established, they were supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the British Crown. And in that act, they created the basis of how to govern those countries. And what is in that act is that they will ensure that there will be a legislative and executive council. But the legislative and executive council constituted British citizens and officers who were within those settlements. For example, in 1843, the members of the executive council for the settlements in the Gambia constituted the person who would be seen as the administrator as well as the colonial secretary. And it went in terms of the legislative council, you will have the administrator who would then ultimately become the governor, that governor would the colonial secretary as well as the judge, chief judge, and the police, the head of the police, the superintendent of police, would constitute part of the legislative council. So these were just advisory bodies to the British Crown. And the British Crown had power to make law for the settlements by creating ordinances which would have to be done with the advice of the Privy Council. And once that happens, it will be an order in council, the king, queen giving an order and then solemnized by the Privy Council, and eventually it will be a regulation in these territories that were settled. That is how the British Crown in 1889 decided that it would impose its domination over the whole of the Gambia. But that had to be a struggle because the kings were not under their domination. That is why the fight that occurred between the King of Combo and the British Crown, starting on the 26th of December 1894, the struggle really became very intense, and an ordinance had to be created on the 26th of February 1894. And that ordinance showed exactly what the British Crown had to do to be able to combat Fode Silla and his forces. And you could see in the ordinance where they will cause curfews between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. so that anybody who moves into the territory that was considered the territory of the British would actually be arrested. You could be imprisoned. You could be forced to work for them. So in essence, they were in absolute control of the area, and they did not want any loyalty to be shown by the people in Batas, in that whole area of St. Mary's, to Halifa Sallah. And they recruited many people to spy for them, and they gave orders to their naval authorities, to their police authorities, so that they will suppress anyone who was in collaboration with Halifa Sallah. That shows the intensity of the resistance and the intensity of the struggle to dominate the territories. Ultimately, by December, the colonial authorities saw the need to establish the Protectorate Ordinance of 1894, where they could begin the process of dominating the whole territory that they call the Gambia after their treaty with France. That led to many struggles. Struggles with Fode Kaba, struggle to tame people like Musa Molo by signing treaties with them so that they will not engage in any fight as they struggle to defeat Fode Kaba, who was there in Jara, in Kiang, in Fonyi, and in certain parts of Senegal. So in essence, by 1894, the determination of the British was to eliminate all those who were resistant to colonial domination and establish the order of the British Crown. That they succeeded in doing. By 1901, after they had eliminated Fode Kaba and they had eliminated Halifa Sallah, they had tamed Musa Molo, and consequently they came up with the 1895 to 1902 Protectorate Ordinance, which created the colony based in Bathurst and Combo St. Mary's, and the protectorate, that is the rest of the country that they had been assigned to by the treaty they signed with France. Gambia thus became a colony of the British Crown. They had their governor, and they had their legislative and executive council. But these were just advisory bodies to the governor. They controlled the territory, ensured that we paid taxes, and their traders were secure to be able to purchase goods and send them back home and import manufactured goods and sold them to our people. They did not have any strategy regarding the development of our country for our people. They had the strategy of developing the country for their interests. But that could not also continue unchallenged. That is why thinkers in the Gambia, as soon as the colonial administration consolidated its power, began to gather information from other parts of the world regarding development. They gathered information after the First World War, where struggles all over the world showed those people who were under colonial domination that that should not be permanent, that they had a right to self-determination and ought to fight to get that right. And that is why soon after the First World War, it became very clear to those who were knowledgeable that Africa could become the architect of her own destiny, that it was time to begin the struggle for the liberation of the continent. 1919, the Pan-African Congress in Paris decided that they will not wait for the colonial powers to meet in France after the First World War and share territories again, which was the custom, that they fight their world wars, and after their world wars, those who lost the battle will cede their territories to the other colonial powers who would see themselves as the victors. The colonial states will continue to be colonies under their domination, and they will continue to enrich themselves at their expense. But this time, the Pan-African Congress decided to call for the liberation of those countries that were under the domination of those powers that were defeated. And Germany was defeated in that war, for example. And Turkey was defeated in that war, for example. Turkey, under the Ottoman Empire, had colonies all over the Middle East. And after the war, all those territories had to struggle for self-determination. The Pan-Africanists also called for the places like Cameroon, Namibia, all those territories that were under Togo, that were under German domination, to be put under trusteeship and prepared for independence. That is when the most profound declaration was made of the future of our continent. The Pan-Africanists emphasized that the colonial powers must now oversee the transition of those countries to independence. And the first task was to ensure that the resources of those countries will be owned by the people in those countries. The land will be used by them to cultivate as much as they could for self-reliant production of what they needed to feed themselves. That investment must not be allowed only to exploit the people at their expense or deprive the people of their land. But investment must be utilized only in areas where the people do not see that they have the strength to use for a time, and the investment must be limited by time. And whatever is derived in resources must also be shared in such a way that the investment will facilitate the development of those territories. They emphasize that labor must be respected and rewarded, and slavery must be abolished, forced labor must be abolished. They emphasize the need that you must have education that was free, education in the language of the colonial powers, but education also in the domestic languages. They emphasize that the teachers must be trained free of charge. Not only must they be able to teach the normal subjects, but they must also teach technical knowledge so that the students will both be armed in academic knowledge as well as technical knowledge. Just imagine, 1990. They emphasize the need that power must be gradually given back to the people, stage by stage, in self-determination, to ensure that there is internal self-government, but move to the further level of democratic participation by ensuring that the consent of the people will determine their manner of government. That's what democracy is all about. Not only did they say that the consent of the people must determine their manner of government, they also emphasized that government must exist for the people and the people must not exist for government. What can be more profound than that in affirming the sovereignty of the people? The Pan-African Congress of 1919 puts in the historical agenda the fight for self-determination and independence. It is no surprise that hand in hand, those who were ready to struggle for the liberation of the continent had to share experiences globally. It is no surprise that in 1920, the National Congress of British West Africa met in Gold Coast, now called Ghana, to prepare the ground for self-determination in Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. Those were the key British colonies in West Africa. That Congress put on the agenda the task of ensuring that taxation must be linked to representation. That the people should not just continue to pay the taxes it gets into colonial coffers and they pay themselves and dominate us. It was important for our children to be educated, for our people to have good health care, to have roads, to be able to have factories, to be able to develop our land. And that was inconceivable as long as the colonialists continued to reduce our economies into producers of raw materials and importers of manufactured goods. They saw the need to prepare the agenda for self-determination. People like Edward Francis Small started the process of conscientization by having the newspaper Gambia Outlook. The British governor told us very clearly what the Gambia Outlook was all about. In 1930, Edward Francis Small was supposed to be an honorary consul for Liberia. But the British opposed to that. And the governor said that Small should not be trusted because after coming from England, he has been producing verbatim articles from newspapers that were against the British Crown. Newspapers that spoke about the killings of workers in India, their domination, their suppression, of Negro workers in other parts of Africa. And Small had been taking those articles and publishing them in his Gambia Outlook so that the Gambian people will see what the suffering of the African people and other people under colonial domination were at that material time. So in that sense, the Small was seen to be dangerous. That was the role of a pioneer for national liberation. By 1924, they had demanded for the elective principle to be applied in the Gambia, so that at least at the level of the councils, local councils, people will elect their local representatives. But the Secretary of State for Colonies wrote and said very clearly that education and political thought had not reached a level that will make the elective principle to be useful in the Gambia. And that was the position of the British Crown. No to the elective principle. Here today, people are saying that we have imported democracy. Our people in 1924 called for the elective principle and to be given the right to self-determination. Democracy was a byproduct of our struggle, the struggle of our people to take charge of their destiny. It was not a gift. By 1929, the workers decided to show that freedom of association should lead to struggle to live in prosperity. They began to demand for higher wages so that they'll be able to live better lives. A refusal to heed their demand led to the 1929 strike. And as a result, the colonial administration recognized that the people were not there just to accept domination without resistance. So they had to concede to their resistance, eventually had to accept the demand that people made that they rejected for local councils to start to have elected representatives. So in that sense, we begin to see local councils in the town of Batas. And the council, with its board of health, controls how Batas was ruled at the time. Eventually, the demand led to even an elected majority over the official majority in the council. But the battle had just started. 1942, The patriots also began to demand for the elective principle in the Legislative Council, because the governor had the power to appoint people in the Legislative Council and the Executive Council as advisory bodies. But the demand of those people who were already appointed by the governor for the elective principle showed that those people were not only interested in position, they were interested in empowering the people. Again, the colonial administration rejected the demand. In 1947, in fact, Governor Blood totally rejected that demand and said that they should not allow for elective principle in the Legislative Council. But essentially, he changed his position eventually and recommended that they must move more and more to at least an official majority in the Legislative Council, so that that unofficial majority, that is those taken out of government offices to be part of the Legislative Council, will give the people voice in the Legislative Council. But again, the colonial administration rejected that, and saying it was not necessary to give the people who were considered to be unofficial representatives, that is, people elected who are not, appointed who were not part of the administration, to have the majority, that was not necessary. But then the demand increased. And what happened eventually? They had the constitutional change in 1947, where we had election for the first time of one seat in the Legislative Council in November 1947. And who was elected? Edward Francis Small was elected. Despite the fact that some people stood who considered themselves to be Muslims, with a country that was considered to be over 95% Muslims, people did not vote on the basis of religion. Despite the fact that some people who stood considered themselves to be part of ethno-linguistic groups that had large representation, people did not consider ethno-linguistic issues at that time to be the basis of selection. Small's dedication to the workers, to the farmers, to the people, his call for national liberation, empowerment of the people, led the people to vote for him. And the battle intensified for the expansion of the elective principle in the Legislative Council and participation of the people in the Executive Council. And the colonies had to yield by ensuring that would be nominated from the Legislative Council to be part of the Executive Council, which was advisory, and the elected representative would constitute members of the Executive Council. That's how Gambia was governed at the time. But then the struggle to take charge of our destiny intensified. That struggle ultimately led to 2 seats being introduced in the Legislative Council for election. Many people stood, but politics had changed. Those who had money were beginning to look at their favorites and were putting money in the political campaigns. Those who were participating in elections were now ready to visit homes and give yards of cloth to women who will be ready to campaign for them, who will become yai campaigns. Insults began, looking at the history of people, their origins, some claiming that they were from royalties and others were not. And consequently, the whole campaign in 1951 changed the whole dimension of politics in the country. And you can imagine Small, who was ready to promote a national league, was put behind, and others who call themselves after other names ultimately became prominent in Gambian politics. What ultimately happened is that Small lost that elections, and Reverend Jesse Faye and the Gabba Jahumpa and this won at the 2 seats. P.S. Njai also became prominent, but took that position. Gambian politics changed. Political parties emerged. The Democratic Party, the Muslim Congress, the United Party. By 1954, these parties were beginning to consolidate their political base. And ultimately, by consolidating their political base, you had a new result in the 1954 elections, where P.S. Njai began to gain ascendancy in the politics of the country. 1954 Constitution created 14 seats, and these people who participated began to gain prominence in the politics of the country. But we were still far behind the struggle for national liberation and self-determination. We were far behind because in 1957, change occurred in Ghana. President Nkrumah, who at that time became Prime Minister of Ghana, stated in March 1957 that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it led to the total liberation of the African continent. Nkrumah was convinced that Ghana alone could not lead a liberation struggle that will ensure that it eradicates poverty. He was convinced that with the world situation, where you had economic might in the hands of few powers, it was suicidal for one country alone to become independent in the other side of the Sahara. Joining Liberia, which was still under domination, even though independent, was not sufficient. Ghana, therefore, saw the need to facilitate the total liberation of the other countries in the continent. His plan was clear, that by uniting Africa, we'll be able to have an African Central Bank, an African Monetary Fund, an African Investment Bank, and therefore inter-African trade. We'll be able to facilitate the 3 levels of development: raw material production, processing of raw materials, and building of machines. Because if you produce your raw materials and you do not process them, you will still be dependent, because there will be value added and sold to you, and obviously those countries will add more value to your raw material and therefore take more money from you. So you will always live in deficit. It is also equally true that if you process, but you are purchasing the machines from them, you will still earn less from them, because their machine will always have added value. So he saw that the total liberation of the continent was only possible if we link raw material production, manufacturing, and machine building. And that could be if we harness the mineral resources of the continent, the oil resources of the continent, all the resources of the continent, to be able to build the mighty banks that would give the type of resources for the investment into machine building, into manufacturing, into raw material production. Ghana's aspiration was more than Ghana, and therefore the Ghanaian people were mistaken when they felt that Nkrumah was simply engaged in a utopian dream. He opened up Ghana to prepare Ghana to gain from the common good of Africa. But Before that was achieved, he was eliminated. But in 1957, he called for the total liberation of the continent. Therefore, movements developed everywhere. In 1957, one could imagine the workers' union gaining great strength in promoting national liberation cause. Political parties also continued to struggle among themselves to gain power in terms of the state. 1959. The colonial administration had to move further because of the demand of people everywhere from colonialism. So it had to prepare itself for that liberation by organizing constitutional conferences and move countries gradually to become independent based on the level of their education and level of their thought and the vociferousness of their demand for independence. Eventually, the PPP also came into being in 1959 in preparation of the constitutional talks. Those constitutional talks gave rise to the 1960 Constitution, which introduced universal suffrage, where the whole country participated in elections, which was not the case in the past. That participation opened up the political landscape, and the struggle intensified for the independence of the country, but also struggle intensified as to political domination by the political parties. I must say the struggle among the political parties for domination took precedence over the struggle for national liberation. Therefore, the struggle to get majority was more important than the struggle to introduce program and make sure that people support the programs of the political party. We all could remember the breaking point in 1961 when the issue of chief minister came to the fore. Many people simply see it as a struggle between the PPP and the UP, between PS Njai and Jawara, between the colonial administration supporting PS Njai as a favorite and against Jawara, and the chiefs also supporting PS Njai as a favorite. Well, if we deal with personalities, that's how we will understand the struggle. But if we understand the issue of liberation, of self-determination, then we will not give too much emphasis to the differences in personalities at the time. First and foremost, Gambian history, and we must now put it everywhere to be known, that the political parties did not have monopoly over the struggle for national liberation and independence. 1961 January, the Gambia Workers' Union decided to take the political stage, first by demanding for increase in the wages of the workers. The colonial administration rejected the increase that they demanded by the Joint Industrial Council, and they went on strike. But the strike became political. Not only were the workers on strike, but schools were ordered to be closed down. As far inland as Kuntuor, the workers working in that whole area also decided to go on strike. So there was a general strike of workers all over the country, irrespective of their ethno-linguistic and religious origins. So that force was so mighty that the colonialists had to invite forces outside of the Gambia to come and suppress the strike of the workers. But ultimately, they had to compromise, knowing that Gambia was no longer the same, that Gambia was now changing, and they had to acknowledge the change that was taking place. I would say that in March, when Jawara decided to reject and resign, reject the decision to make PS Njai the chief minister, he could read the tempo in the country, that change was imminent. And any of the leaders, P.S. Njai, Jawara, any of them could capitalize on the spirit of that change and move the country to independence. And there is absolutely no doubt that with the tempo, the civil servants under Saho rejecting, MM Jallo rejecting the workers, ultimately the society, the cream of society, the civil servants, the workers, had shown the colonial administration that it could not rule the whole way. And therefore, the Constitutional Conference of 1961 gave rise to the change that moved us gradually to independence. 1961 brought about the starting point of the descent of the colonial order. In 1962, you had the 1962 Constitution, which provided the basis to move towards internal self-government. But externally, the colonial authority still remained dominant. It is no surprise that on the 4th of October 1963, Gambia attained internal self-government under a premier, and D.K. Jawara became the premier of the country. By that time, those who say that Gambia was an improbable country and the colonials never thought that it could be independent should reflect again to see that they are wrong. 1963 witnessed the birth of the OAU. It was no longer possible for any country in Africa to be denied its independence without a struggle. And the colonial administration that knew that decided to at least leave those countries to become independent on demand. Number two, Ghana had become independent and became a republic. Sierra Leone had become independent and became a republic. Nigeria had become independent and became a republic. And these were the three plus Gambia, then four British colonies in West Africa. So it was not possible for Gambia not to be prepared for independence. What the colonization did not want to do is to continue to give aid to the Gambia after independence. It had not done much to build the productive base of the economy, to also prepare the ground for taxation, to prepare the ground for taxation. It is important that it was not possible at that time for Gambia to be suppressed. It had to be left to move at its pace to become independent. It is therefore no surprise that after we gain internal self-government, we had to move to the next stage of external self-government. External self-government meaning that now Gambia will relate to other countries on the basis of equality and that its prime minister will be free to go all over the world to be able to exchange a relationship with other countries. That could not be until Gambia gained external self-determination and external self-government. I am using these terms so that we understand them properly. Internal self-government and external self-government. What does that mean? Gambia is said to become independent in 1965. But if you look at the 1965 Constitution, you will see that a Governor General had to remain in our territory, represent Her Majesty, the Queen of England. How could a sovereign country have a Governor General representing a foreign monarch? Obviously, that country cannot be said to be sovereign. And that was the situation under the 1965 Constitution, that the Gambia was still under the sovereignty of the British monarch. That's why we had the Governor General, and the Governor General had powers. Number one, Her Majesty constituted the executive, the president of the country, the executive of the country, represented by the Governor General. And Parliament comprised Her Majesty and the House of Representatives. The Governor General had power to prorogue, that is, suspend the House of Representatives. The Governor General also had authority to be advised by Cabinet. And the Governor General, under the dominance of Her Majesty, had to assent to any law that became, any bill that became a law. So essentially, we're talking about external self-governance, meaning that the Prime Minister, under the 1965 Constitution, will go and develop relationship with other countries in the world. But notwithstanding, still sovereignty resided in the British Crown. That is why we are saying that we had not attained the right to independence. In 1965, we had not attained independence. We attained a right, but we did not become independent. We had a right to self-determination. Yes, that was the right. But we did not exercise that right to become fully independent, to become a sovereign territory. That is the truth. That's why we said that we attained internal self-determination, external self-determination. But we fell short of independence. That is why we had a referendum in November 1965 to decide whether we were going to become a sovereign republic or not. The referendum failed. About 61,000 voted yes, 31,000 no, and almost 60,000 plus decided to abstain. So we could not get the two-thirds majority. Why? Because politics was not about the nation, was not about the people. Those who were participating did not see the need to have a common agenda to move the country towards a republic and then compete who would be president. Politics was still a politics based on personality. And you could hear the insults among the politicians. You could see the giving of cloth among the politicians, the giving of gifts among the politicians, the promotion of ethno-linguistic loyalties among the politicians, religious loyalties among the politicians. What was missing is to educate the people to know that sovereignty should reside in them, and when it does, power must be derived from their consent, and power must be exercised to promote their prosperity and their liberty. There is no doubt that if all the political leaders in the country had the agenda in 1965 November to educate the Gambian citizenry that what we were struggling for is for sovereignty to reside in them rather than a foreign monarch. And that when that sovereignty is deposited in them, no authority will be able to govern them that they do not support, and no authority will be fit to govern them that does not exercise the power entrusted to them to promote their general welfare. If that was the message in all our languages, from Khartoum to Qaeda, which living Gambian at the time would be opposed to a republic? That was not done. It was just yes or no. Yes for the person who you support, no for the person you do not support. That was the shortcoming of the political evolution of our country. Education, yes. Political thought, yes. But what type of education? What type of political thought? You can be linguistically educated, academically educated, and still be a political illiterate, lacking maturity in political thought. And this is precisely the problem of our country. That our struggle to become a republic was suspended for 5 years, derailed for 5 years, because of political illiteracy. And again, in April 1970, the people were tested again. This time, they voted yes in the majority. But one doubts why they voted yes in the majority. Because they were not really sensitized to know that the whole object of the struggle to become a republic was to ensure that sovereignty will reside in them. So one would conclude that people voted because change had come and political cooptation had increased. Once the PPP consolidated power, most of those people who were in the opposition started to be co-opted into the party and into ministerial posts, into positions of advantage. And as a result, when they come with all their supporters. And since political posts, administrative posts were being dished out, one would very much feel that if you get closer to power, then you will also get the benefit of power. And that could have likely contributed to the change that occurred and Gambia became a sovereign republic in 1970. 1970, Gambia became a sovereign republic. The republic required a president and a parliament whose fundamental aim was to utilize the national resources for our development, to eradicate the poverty of our people, and ensure that we have both liberty and prosperity. But Gambia went through 30 years of development only to end up with a coup d'etat in 1994. And we look at those 30 years of development and we ask ourselves what the meaning was to become a republic. Many people will still be asking the question, why? What benefit? The reason being that the republic we constituted did not include the people. It was a sovereign republic without a sovereign people. First of all, you must build a people. And to build a people means that you must break down the linguistic barriers, ethno-linguistic barriers, the religious barriers, the cultural barriers. You must ensure that a nation is built. And you cannot build a nation without nationhood. You cannot build nationhood without a citizenry. It means that 1970 should have been the basis of building the Gambian people. And you cannot build a Gambian people without giving them that consciousness of nationhood, to know that they belong to the same nation, and that the nation is the apex of our sense of belonging, of our culture, of our way of life. 1970 should have led every single Gambian to develop a sense of belonging to the Gambia. There should have been a new Gambian in 1970. That is the only way we could have had a new Gambia. But that new Gambian did not arise. Farmers were left in the countryside, workers in the urban area, many of the civil servants around, everybody just fending for himself or herself. But no one helped people to understand what the nation was all about. In 1970, if we had taught the people that ownership of power must be linked to the ownership of the wealth of the country, what is the use of being told that you own a home where you do not have any authority to decide who enters, who leaves, and what is done there? When we say sovereignty resides in the people, it must be translated into ownership of the country. And ownership of the country must be translated into ownership of the wealth of the country. It means that our marine, terrestrial, atmospheric resources must be our common property. And government is established to protect those resources and harness it in our common interests. If we had that notion in 1970, then the first task of the government would have been citizenship education in all our school systems, building up a media that will educate the people to know who they are and to know that they are Gambian people. Number two, there would have been a reconstitution of the economy. Reconstituting the economy would have led for us to see the three phases of the economic life of the country, and also see the three branches that now exist. You have agriculture, you have industry, you have the services. In agriculture, from the very beginning, we had the capacity to feed ourselves. We have arable land, water everywhere. We could grow anything we want. We can produce all the fruits, all the vegetables, all the all the animals we need to be able to live decent lives. From the very beginning, in order to have food self-sufficiency and self-reliance in food production, the first thing to have been done is to look at our domestic agricultural resources. You go abroad, you find all sorts of fruits, all sorts of nuts being put in packages and sold in supermarkets. Do we have that botanical garden where we had utilized proper research to know all the edible fruits, nuts, and plants in our homeland? Just imagine, even a younger generation, not to talk about the older generation, what type of fruits and nuts and edible plants we had. Where are they? All this could have been developed and transformed into production so that we distribute them and ensure that we have all the nuts and fruits and plants we need to feed ourselves. I am sure in the local languages, each of you, and I challenge you, just name the number of fruits and nuts that you used to eat when you were young, whether you are from up country or down. Many of them are becoming extinct. rare to see. Why? Because we did not consciously build a nation to feed ourselves. We had capacity to build a community system where the state will engage in production, harness our mineral resources, prospect for them, discover them. At that time, in 1970 when we became a republic, if we did proper prospecting, we would have discovered all the minerals available in the Gambia. And we would have been able to harness that and put it into our investment banks, into our central banks, to ensure that we have sovereign national wealth. And we could have relied on that to give all the family farms all the seed, fertilizer, and farming implements they need. At that time, can you imagine if those farms were working in that way? 50 years, the Golden Jubilee, what type of Gambia would we have had by now? Who will be talking about hunger? Which farming community will be living in huts? We all know that you do not only need individual consumption, you also need social consumption, schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure. Can you imagine if the villages were organized in such a way that the arable land that they are not using for their family farms will now be used as village farms, given fertilizers and farming implements, and they produce on those farms? And what is produced is put in the village treasury for the nursery schools, for hospitals, for boreholes, for everything, for milling machines, everything that they needed. Would there have been poverty in those villages by now? So you would have seen development at the individual level of the homes and development at the social level in terms of the community and infrastructure. That is what development required. If you harness our ocean and its wealth, build the fishing vessels that we needed, how many captains would we have produced? How many people working with them? And how many factories in the processing of fish would we have established by now? And the sovereign national wealth that is derived from there, how many roads would we have built? How many hospitals? How many schools? Infrastructure? How many training centers to prepare our teachers, prepare our nurses, accountants, our lawyers? This is what was needed. And you will have seen that at that material time, the rapid development of the multiplying effect of development, and everybody would have work somewhere. What we were producing as agricultural production, could we not have looked at GPMB, how it started to transform the groundnuts into oil, into groundnut cake, and the groundnut cake could feed the cattle. Not only that, the groundnut shell could be torn into cardboards. So every product could have multiple of products. So everything that you can think of. And all these industries would have been available for our people to generate employment and to feed ourselves and take care of our needs and build our infrastructure. That is what was expected in 1970. But that did not happen. We continue to produce groundnuts and import everything else. We continue to produce groundnuts and import everything else. Our villages deprived of treasury and means of getting income, waiting for taxes to be collected by councils and passed back to them in terms of village development. You tax poor people and use the poor people for their own development again. by transferring those same taxes to them. When will you develop? You will not have individual development, you will not have social development. And that is the consequence of misplacement of priority since 1970. So ultimately what happened? We reached a situation where our imports were more than our exports, and we suffered from trade deficits year after year. Since we were deriving revenue only from taxation, and all the public corporations that were established were made to become bankrupt by mismanagement, we could not derive much from the public corporation to get sovereign national wealth. And consequently, by 1985, the president had told the Gambian nation that the nation was bankrupt. It was no longer able to pay for its services abroad, not even able to pay in the United Nations and other bodies. That it could not even import. There was scarcity of goods. People tend to forget this. When they recall the past, they tend to forget this. Because of the nightmare of the Second Republic, they forgot the nightmare of the First Republic. So as a result, the president said that he was going to introduce an economic recovery program. And that economic recovery program led to what? They had to retrench workers, and the civil service was left with only about 16,000 employees. Places like PWD closed down. And in many sectors, workers were retrenched. But that was not enough. To be able to pay their debts, they had to sell, divest from public enterprises. NTC was sold. Gambia Commercial and Development Bank, which had almost half the funds of all the commercial banks in the country, was the major commercial bank of the country, had become bankrupt. Depositors over 100 million, and you had only 20 million in your coffers. So the bank had to be sold to Meridian. And then government had to take over the debt after trying to maintain the losses year after year. 1 year 72 million, another one 26 million, all from the national budget to be able to sustain the bank. It could not sustain it. It divested from it. Gambia, the GPMB, which was the major industrial base of the country, and had in 1977 over 100 million in its foreign accounts, depleted that. And by 1992, the government said it was no longer viable, losses after losses, and that it developed the prospectus to ensure that it is divested from. Eventually, it was sold. So the major base of production that would have generated employment dissipated and disappeared, and poverty increased. Ultimately, you had the coup d'etat of 1994. They exploited the poverty of the people. In fact, the councils could not even provide taps to the population, and eventually, even the taps that were provided, they were insisting that they must pay to draw water from them. That was the case in Birkam. That led to that big demonstration in Birkam, which a day after was followed by a coup d'etat. And it means that those people who carried out the coup d'etat were exploiting the sentiments of the people, and therefore people should not have been surprised to see the young people jubilating at that time, not knowing what a coup d'etat meant. But our republic became halted on the 22nd of July, 1994. People call that a revolution. But the revolution in 1970 was what? For sovereignty to reside in the people. We should not lose focus of that. That a republic means that sovereignty resides in the people. We said that throughout the First Republic, a sovereign republic existed without a sovereign people. So a revolution means to create the sovereign people. So the only addition that could have been made to 1970 is to ensure that the sovereign republic now has a sovereign people. But in 1994, instead of bringing a sovereign people, the republic itself was suspended. And people whose power was derived from the barrel of the gun took over the political mantle of the state and became both lawmaker and executive. They were both members of the executive and legislative council, returning to the colonial days of where you had executive and legislative council comprising the governor and those who control power. And that was, in terms of political evolution, a retrogression, not a progression into the future. And that is why all those who are conscious of that journey of the Gambian people from colonial domination, where sovereignty resides in a monarch, to a republic where sovereignty should reside in them, but because they were kept ignorant in education and political thought, they could not realize that, knew that we must move forward, that after the removal of a president by force, we must move now to build a republic where sovereignty will reside in the people. That is why the demand for move towards bringing about the republic and bringing about the sovereignty of the people was the call after 22nd July 1994. Many people question why we refused to accept ministerial posts at that time, and even preferred to go to jail by demanding that the powers of the people must not be obstructed and that the right, the freedom of expression of the people cannot be restricted, that the pen will not be broken. It will continue to write, to educate, so that we move to the next phase. And Gambia did move to elections in 1996 and in 1997 to the establishment of the Second Republic with an executive and National Assembly. But what type of executive, what type of National Assembly? We have said the failure of 1970 is the failure to make the people sovereign, to transform our educational institutions, to transform our culture, so that all of us as Gambians will see ourselves as citizens of a nation. And nationhood will be promoted for us to love our country and love our people. We failed to do that. We suffered for it. And 1997 should have given rise to a second republic where again the educational system will educate all of us, the media will educate all of us. In fact, it was injected in the 1997 Constitution to have a National Council for Civic Education to help people to understand what is in that Constitution, to know what sovereignty means, to know that power must be derived from the people and power must be exercised in the interest of the people. That is the cornerstone of our republic. But that was also rejected. It was there in the books. But those who preside over the affairs of the state never had that sense of nationhood, that love of people and country, to a point that they see it as their primary preoccupation, as their vision and mission, to enable each Gambian to develop that sense of nationhood. Politics as usual, power struggle for the cake. Power struggle for the cake. Power struggle for the national cake. Transforming a nation into a cake where you must divide for people to share. Rather than empowering people to work together to enhance our liberty and prosperity. So we started the journey again, sinking into powerlessness of the people and centralized position of power in the hands of the executive. Ultimately, we had to come together again to effect change on the 2nd of December 2016. The objective of coming together was to put the past behind us, to put the republic in front of us, build a sense of nationhood, a sense of common destiny, a sense of ownership of our motherland, and bring all people together, one Gambia, one nation, one people, so that we build the republic that we deserve to call our homeland. To build the republic we deserve to call our homeland. And pass on, bequeath to other generations so that they'll be proud of us. But that republic that we are here now to commemorate is still in limbo. It is in the constitutions, but it's not in the institutions, it's not in the mindset, it's not in the way of life, it's not our culture. So what we must do today is to interrogate what happened and where we are and where we must go. Unless we do that, we have no future. As long as we continue to repeat that everything is gloom and doom, we will still not move forward. If we are to move forward, we must refuse to be put to sleep. We must refuse to be put to sleep. We've been asleep for too long. And the consequence is to be born in poverty, to grow up in poverty, to grow old in poverty, and to die in poverty. That is unacceptable. And because it's unacceptable, we must search for a solution, and the solution is right there in our hands. We own the country, we own the ocean, we own the minerals, we own the sun, we own everything that shines, which we can transform into energy. So it's left to us. we have the means, we can build all the services that we need to live in liberty and prosperity. In that regard, this anniversary is not an ordinary one. It is taking place at a time when there is lockdown all over the world. And because of our poverty, we are locked down by poverty, locked down by disease, and locked down by poverty. But the disease is telling us that the world can be closed to us, so that we find it difficult to leave our borders in search of greener pastures. The question is, are we doomed? The question is, are we cursed? Are we the wretched of the earth? Are we like all those donkeys and goats who cannot think for themselves and cannot chart their own destiny? We see right in our face canoes going and harnessing fish, only to come and say, well, where do we keep it? Where do we sell it? Who will answer those questions? It's you and me, because we are looking for a way to make that possible. The resources are there. How do we harness it? How do we ensure that everybody gets to it? That is the challenge that we are facing. Democracy is our birthright. It's not a gift. It evolves out of our struggle to take charge of our destiny. It is part and parcel of our sovereignty, part and parcel of our ownership of our homeland. And we should treasure that democracy, the right to be able to choose our manner of government. Now, there is no excuse for any of us. 2nd December 2016, we all joined the queue and brought about the change. No one doubts that power belongs to us. How do we entrust that power? That is the challenge. So if we are complaining that we are not deriving what we ought to, we must equally ask ourselves the question, why are we entrusting power to those who we are entrusting power to? When we entrust power, we expect dividend. The dividend is liberty and prosperity. If we do not derive it, then our investment is foolhardy. The message today is precisely that. Your destiny is in your own hands. Know yourself, know your country, know the world. Then you'll be the architect of your own destiny. Know yourself, know your country, and know the world. Then you will not be a slave to any human being on the face of the earth. Know yourself, know your country, and know the world. And you will live in liberty, dignity, and prosperity.
Thank you very much. This is a very big one, and we have thousands of people that said this should be a book, that they are encouraging you to write a book in regards to the history, historical history. And if you can have this in our curriculum, people to know the real history of the Gambia, because what you have explained is totally different from what has been they have been talked about. But somebody has said you didn't talk about the 81 coup d'etat, whether that is not part of our history, because it's something very key. But you give the dates, from the 1880s, coming out about 81, nothing was said about that. And it might be a historical day for the Gambia, where you can highlight something about that area too. So these are some of those comments that I will.
It is important that we have these sessions over and over again. This is just the beginning. That is why it is encyclopedic in stretching it throughout history, but we must break down the periods. 1981 was not a change. It was a skirmish. It occurred at a time when the Republic began to face challenges in being able to deliver the goods that the people anticipated. Many young people had lost faith in the electoral system, and they were beginning to look for other ways of bringing about change. And that was common in our region at the time. Many forces felt that coup d'etat and overthrowing a government had been ways and means of being able to effect change. What happened in 81 was a process that many people did not understand. First and foremost, some people felt that it was a force from Libya that actually brought about a change. But so many forces were at work in 1981. Only for a group of people to organize themselves, went to the armory, took over the guns, and then many called people to come, and of course, many people went there to take guns. Who was in control? There were announcements. Yes, this is the type of government that will be established, but all those were just mere statements. The coup makers had no link with any foreign power that would come to their aid in times of need. And internally also, they were not an organized force. It was a heterogeneous force, unorganized force, and as a result, everybody could come and take over power. And as you can see, at the initial phase, there were a lot of killing among those people who considered themselves to be leaders in that setting, because they were not of the same brand. Ultimately, what it led to is Senegal intervening. If Senegal knew that its soldiers were going to die the way they died, and that the coup will ultimately end the way, suppression of the coup will end the way, most likely Abdou Diouf would not have chosen to come. But in coming, the coup makers were already disorganized, and in fact, the leader of the coup had exited, and left the country, and consequently, the rest had to give up, and Jawara came back to office. That was a miracle. One must say that the coming back to office was a miracle. But just like we have already analyzed, the coup was not the way to build the republic. It is just a way of changing political office. And we'll have many changes of political office, whether through the barrel of a gun or through elected processes that may not lead to the sovereignty of the people. And the lesson is that the coup did not even succeed finally, and did not lead to the sovereignty of the people. No lessons were learned from it to build the sovereignty of the people. That is really the lesson. You can go deeper into analyzing some of the challenges of sovereignty. And I will just mention one. When the Senegalese government intervened, ultimately it intervened because of security concerns. And consequently, there was the Senegambia Confederation, which came into being in 1982. And because of the arrangement that was made, the Confederation really abrogated, in fact, the type of relation that Senegal and Gambia should have, which is a people-to-people relation where we become one people and two states, and try to complement each other's development rather than one imposing will on the other. Because the Confederation led to an imposition of the will of the Senegalese presidency over the Gambian presidency, because this confederal agreement provided for the Senegalese president always to be the president of the Confederation and the Gambian president always to be the vice president of the Confederation rather than a rotational presidency. It created a National Assembly which gave greater majority to the Senegalese. It created a situation where Senegal contributed about 56 million, Senegal 52 million, Gambia 26 million, but combined, most of the funds went to the confederal forces, which were dominated mainly by Senegal, instead of infrastructure development. And you had these confederal ministers, confederal parliamentarians collecting two salaries. So at the end of the day, the Confederation really was a bureaucratic mechanism of really extending the security, external security of Senegal. And we exposed, we wrote quite a lot on the Confederation, especially this particular point that really negated the sovereignty of the Gambian Republic. Because Section 59 of the 1970 Constitution emphasized that nobody who is a national representative in the House of Representatives should ever be under the obedience, adherence of any foreign power or state. But if you look at the Confederal Agreement, it empowered the Confederal President to call a state of emergency. And when he calls a case of emergency, he had the power to take over any resource exceeded to execute the state of emergency and direct anybody, including the President of the Republic, to do what is going to help the Confederal President to be able to execute what was necessary to deal with the situation that called for the state of emergency. So in that regard, it really negated the sovereignty of the country, and I'm sure that by the continuous exposure that this was never intended to serve the Senegalese or Gambian interests, but a power play. It seemed like President Jawara developed cold feet, and Abdou Diouf recognized that this person was stalling the other parts of the integration process, and therefore decided to pull out his troops without even informing the president. We reported on this in our Fourier newspaper that Senegal has pulled its troops, and even Jawara had not known that. And we were being scolded that what we were saying was just, but eventually they confirmed, because we had privileged information, and that this was done. They just abandoned the State House. Eventually, that the Confederation had come to an end. But President Diouf never told President Jawara that he was pulling out his troops, never told him that the Confederation was going to be torn to shreds. He just did it. And one can see that it had an impact in 1994, that when the coup attempt succeeded this time, and Senegal would have been the only country that can get the international community to intervene, decided also not to intervene, but in fact accommodated those who carried out the coup. So one can see what international relation really means. We are not only talking about a sovereign Gambia, we are also talking about a sovereign Africa. Let's call it a collective sovereignty. To move to a dimension where states can relate on the basis of equality and mutual interest, and therefore their protection will be secured through that mutual interest. Gambia-Senegal could have been an example of what African unity could be by ensuring that the relation is free from any domination of any sort, but that it is based on cooperation for mutual interest.
Thank you, Honorable Sallah. I just want to buttress there's this Ibrahim who asked this question. He said, what can we do to bring back the GB, this is the ERP project, that is the economic, that was the economic recovery program, that's the GMPD, that's the GMPB, that's the government, that's the collapse of that institution. He said by then those were institutions that were creating employment for the Gambian people during that tenure of time, and they were, when up that extent, they created cooperatives, and those things were supported, and it was even helping the workers to have some, at least funds that they can gather together collectively. So what can we do as a country? Because we have the fishing, still now we have the vast river here that we can use, we have the agricultural production here, and we still cultivate the agriculture. What can we do to bring back this institution like the ones at Saros and the other? What can we do?
Well, that's an issue of policy. That is what all Gambians should be looking for now. When a political party comes and says, entrust power to me, what should you ask? What is your program? That is the program we are calling for. We are saying, from the very beginning, Edward Francis Moore built these unions, the farmers' union, workers' union, to empower the people, because most people are farmers and workers, to empower them so that they will take charge of the prices of their crops. They will also take charge in terms of their production. And government's duty is to help to empower them. That is the fundamental base of small politics throughout. And that when PPP came into being, it had the primary objective of building cooperatives and supporting the cooperative union. The cooperative union was established, and there were consumer cooperatives as well as producer cooperatives, in the sense that they will give crop financing, and they will also bring rice and other consumer goods. But what ended up happening is bureaucracy. And as long as you have that bureaucracy, nothing works. Because the GPMB would go and get loans from the Gambia Commercial and Development Bank. The cooperative union will also go and get loans from the Gambia Commercial and Development Bank. Instead of building sovereign national wealth, and the country could have, and the country should still build that, because you have minerals. Batakonku Sanyang Kato. Where are the minerals? They will say, let's get a company from China. Excuse me, I should not just mention one state where there is America, China. I don't want to appear like I'm anti any particular country, but a particular country and say, come and invest. They invest. What is government share? Well, we pay for license, we get, so you get minuscule from it. And what happened? All that wealth go into somebody's coffers. That is what you call sovereign national wealth. Even if you cannot harness it, well, harness it in partnership where you receive the largest share. And when you receive the largest share, make sure that you are buying the equipment, you are building the equipment so that you will have larger and larger share. So that large share is what you put in a cooperative bank. What are we saying today? Everybody is saying businesses are collapsing. We need the state to intervene. Farmers cannot feed themselves. We need the state to intervene. Where is the state going to get the money? From taxation, or from borrowing, or from grants? So now we are beginning to see the need for the state to have wealth to be able to assist those people who are sinking. But we are not concerned where the state is going to derive the money. So, and that is what sovereign national wealth is designed to do, to ensure that in the areas of mining, have the majority share or full control. What comes from it, put it in your coffers. It becomes cooperative bank. Get the fishing vessels rather than naval ships. Yes, we need to protect the waters. But why not also every naval ship with every trawler? So that they accompany each other and protect the sea and produce from our sea and put it in sovereign national wealth. Now, with that, clearly, what happened with the last cooperative is important to know, and what should. The last cooperative gets loan from the bank, give it to the farmer, expecting interest, not only for the bank but also for the cooperative. When will you free the farmer from poverty? The GPMB will also come, take loans from the bank to come and purchase the farmer's nuts. Not only to purchase to pay back what is taken from the bank, but also to purchase and get some profit. Well, the farmer is being squeezed from both sides. from the side of production and from the side of sale. And that is why the farmer became so poor, and when they also mismanage the resources of both. GPMB, I've already told you, became bankrupt and had to be sold. And Cooperative Union also became bankrupt, that they had to establish a commission of inquiry, Macaulay Commission, in 1993, to look into the failure of the bank, of the Cooperative Union. So I don't know why those who have managed this institution, they are still alive, and they keep on writing fairy tales and giving stories about success of the cooperatives during that time. You know, it collapsed because the potential was not exploited. What is supposed to be different is that squeezing of wealth from the farmer, that scraping of the back of the farmer. That is what must stop. And how do you stop it? Create sovereign national wealth, where you can now ensure that a cooperative bank is established that can go to the farmer, give seed, fertilizer, and farming implement of the family farms. Therefore, they will produce large scale. They'll be able to build their houses. They'll be able to live decent lives. They'll be able to move to mechanization. That is possible. And they will pay back, not interest, but just service charges. So in that sense, then, you are not really scraping the back of the farmer. Same thing, when you look at the price of the world market, you ensure that what is most will go to the farmer. Just service charges will be taken in terms of those who are maintaining the cooperative bank, so that they'll be able to purchase the produce of the farm. Obviously, with that, farming will become very productive and lucrative. And not only farming, you can do that with processing. How many people are around sitting down without jobs? How many came from GTTI? The cooperative bank can give groups or individuals all these milling machines so that they will process what is coming from the farmers. Look at us now. Are we not consuming coos as flour, baked as bread? So could we not package it so that people can cook it? So in essence then, imagine how many families consume bread and how much flour can be produced from coos. And you can have a whole factory of young people. We're talking about light scale, small scale, appropriate technology, put in the hands of the people. They'll be producing this flour, milling and producing. And the bakers will buy those flours. And to a group of people who are doing the milling. You can organize society in that way. And it'll be a chain of production. Obviously, that is possible. The same thing with all the factories that should establish, oil making, the former GPMB is still there. Old machines, etc. These things you could have rehabilitated many years ago. And by those rehabilitation, you can ensure that we produce oil, we produce groundnut cake, we can move into making even other products. Building our roads, you see the cockle shells. You can transform these cockle shells into, we use them as whitewash, into paint. There are so many other things. That's science. Look at our people up country. They used to make this cloth from cotton, very durable, using handicraft. You use this as towels. Use it as bath cloth. We can produce all the towels, all the bath cloth, all these things that we need in the country. And tourists will come and take home and say, well, this is a Gambian product. The botanical garden that we've talked about. If you look at the Tomboron, Sedem, Mampata, where are they? These are things that could have been in the stores. Tourists will come and enjoy Gambian tropical fruits. But go to the market, you will find abundant apples. And this is what we consume, and we feel that, well, we are living the life that an affluent person is living. But we have all these fruits, the different types of papaya, just name them. Everything is there. But all are disappearing. We can transform these kabas and all this into juice, into all the products. So in short, we have everything we need to survive. But the driving force is what is missing. We are leaving the driving force to chance. That here and there somebody will come and establish a factory and invest in the Gambia. A bank will give a loan to somebody. A private sector will bring about development. This is just simply fairy tale. Anybody with money should have opportunity to be able to invest, rightly so. But then the driving force is those who control our commonwealth. Those who control our sea, our minerals, the decision makers, they are the drivers of development. And once we have that, obviously we'll have development.
Somebody was asking, he said, for him to understand that our problem is leadership. As you mentioned, we have a problem of leadership. But why do we have that problem? Because we are not voting based on a program or a policy that convinces us, but we are voting based on a personality. And this personality, there is a contract even prior to the election that if you happen to support me, if I win, I will compensate you like a national cake, like you said. So this is why it is difficult for a vast majority of the government. And how can we change that mentality of changing our politics into a politic of patronage or a politic of personality or politic of a sectional group? I belong to the same group with this party, because unless we fight, that's the battle. And if you don't win that, we will not have the competent people to be in the office, because people are voting for somebody for a compensation, and it happens to be a contract rather in the election. And if they feel with this party, he can win, everybody just join him because of his policies or program. And unless we fight that mindset, we cannot move. So what do you think should be it? Because that's the problem we are having as a country for the place of observation.
Well, he is liberated already. The fact that he has identified the problem. For him, he has a solution. What he has done is what everybody must do. And if you have done it, help others to do it. This is the time for the people. It's not time for leaders. 2nd December is the lesson. No one was more powerful than the person we removed from office. That's the lesson. That power is in the hands of the people. Let's educate each other to change mindsets. That is what is important, because all of us will criticize that this is wrong for different interests. We must be able to distinguish all the criticism and see which criticism is actually leading us to a solution. It's not all criticisms that lead us to a solution, but the voices will be louder and louder from all quarters that something is wrong, change should come. Fine. We should become now more reserved, more contained, and begin to assess, yes, but change for what? And we must know what must come after that. And if it does not happen, then we are conscious that what we wanted did not happen, then of course that will be there. That will not longer be there. And that is the type of change that is necessary. It must be a conscious change. And that is a matter of must, because otherwise the poverty will continue and the suffering will continue. But our destiny is in our own hands. Unfortunately, it's not in our individual hands, it is in our collective hands. So if we know, we must help others to know. That is the time. Our time now is to move away from the anger and frustration and help each other to listen and learn and change our mindset. Once we do that, we'll be the architect of a new destiny of liberty and prosperity.
Yeah, well, I think we don't have any more questions. This guy was just asking my opinion in regards to what he was saying, that what was the population of the Gambia in 1970 and the percentage of educated Gambians. I think PPP government was trying to develop the human resources of the country from 1970 so that Gambia can control the country. What do you think?
Well, again, for us, we are not here just to pass judgment, because we know history is a process. If you look at personalities, you'll always say a personality has achieved this or has not achieved that. We're not involved in personality analysis. What we are involved in is analyzing what the Gambia is all about as a state and its evolution from colonial period up till now. We have looked at the state. We are telling you that in 1970, you have seen the election that took place to transform Gambia into a republic. And the republic was achieved. 2/3 majority achieved the republic. That is the fact that is important. Now, looking at population, looking at resources, we are saying that if you get into that domain, you will mislead yourself. Because the issue was not about population and the resources. The issue then was the sovereign Gambian, that every sovereign Gambian needed a government that will sit down and build up a plan of how to develop agriculture and how to develop industry and how to develop building of the appropriate technology so that we will have balanced and proportionate development. You will have development in the countryside and you have development in the urban areas. And that should have led to a new life for all of us 50 years after that. We are not saying some schools were not built, some hospitals maybe, and roads built. You can always go into that these things were done, etc., etc., etc. But what we are actually telling you is that by the end of the regime by the government we took office in 1970, it has completely ran the economy to its knees. That is the fact that we have given you, and it increased the poverty rate at that time, and we've told you how institutions like GPMB, all that, NTC, all were divested from. Institutions like PWD, we used to employ people, all collapsed. That's what we are telling you. And we are saying those people who took over in 1994 could have built schools, could have built, but how did they end up? You've seen that 48% of the population continue to live on less than $1 a day, 60% less than $100 and you see that how many young people were coming out of schools, 400,000, 500,000 every 12 years. Where were they to have employment? Husband and wife, how will they live without employment? How many young people live in stable homes where they have wives or have husbands with their children and feeding each other? So essentially, that poverty remains, the poverty in the countryside, the poverty in the urban area. So we should not lose sight of that. So it's not giving excuse for our government. That's what should not be. Nobody should lead a country and lead it to poverty. Every person who leads a country should lead it to prosperity. If you cannot, then jump ship and allow others to move, captains to go. But that cannot just be a demand. It's a work of the people. It is the people who should do that. That's what we are saying.
Thank you very much. People are still asking us the higher question whether you will have these books so that it can be available in the curriculums and the others, or it can be a book that will be available for them to have this access to.
Well, of course, many books have been written. There is this right to self-determination and independence. But, the issue is that we must now enter a new phase. That's why we are introducing the new phase with this discourse on the 50th anniversary of the Republic. There is the book coming, The Juridical Foundation of the Republic, which will contain all these elements. It's more comprehensive because the objective is to prepare the citizenry to build a new Gambia. And it is hoped that with that book, at least I would have done my summation of all these years of learning and experience into something that will be bequeathed to the future generation. That is the objective. Well, it has been long. Those who became bored, we apologize because this was not meant to be an inspirational speech. Here and there I tried to do that, but it was meant to give information. And hopefully if you are used to it, we'll be having more of this to be able to give information, knowledge, so that we'll be able to use it as food for thought to become the architects of our own destiny. Of course, the inspirational speeches will come for those who live by inspiration so that they become more motivated. But we hope that people will now want to read more and want to listen more to what gives you information to know yourself, to know your country, to know the world. We must, at this stage, transform information into knowledge and knowledge into a way of life. That is the trajectory, transforming information into knowledge and knowledge into a way of life. If we do that, we'll build a culture of liberty and prosperity for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The guys are saying they are not bored. They are really enjoying this lecture. So they are not even bored. That's all we have for you in the history of the. We just want to make a flashback back to the 1970 when Gambia became a republic, and this was the day when we have no control. There's no foreign power that controls or dictates this country, but we become a sovereign republic whereby the power and authority is vested in the president of the Republic of the Gambia, not somebody representing the Queen of UK. So we were just giving a gist or a flashback of the history of this country, and for sure we will have more of this conversation as he promised. And this is all what I have for you. It is your brother. Bye. Wow.